with our first child, we did what many first-time, maybe most first-time parents do. We called everybody. First thing, call everybody. Parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and siblings and the guy we met in the grocery store, classmates, everybody. We wanted them to know that this thing that we'd been waiting for so long had finally happened. And we wanted them to be part of that too. Now, as it happened, that night that Amy went into labor, my mom had an appointment elsewhere, and so we reached her there. And my dad was at home, so we reached him there. And Mom then came back home later that night to find all the lights off. And so she came in and she called for my dad and heard his voice. So she followed the voice upstairs and called again, and sure enough, down the hall, and called again and around the corner into the bedroom, and she flipped on the lights, and there, lying on top of the bedspread of a fully made bed, fully clothed with his shoes on, lay my dad, eyes wide open. So they looked at each other, and they said, well, we can be sleepless here, or we can be sleepless at the hospital. Let's do that. And so they came, and they waited in the hospital, and because it was a first-time labor, oh, did they wait. It takes a long time. But they patiently waited there, sleepless, I do believe. Until finally, after that night and the following morning and the whole next afternoon, Amy's mom had by this point arrived and spent the time with them as they were waiting there in that waiting room that they had come to know very well. Finally, it happened. Out that double swinging door, down that long hallway, around the corner into now their new home in the waiting room, came the cry of the baby. And they knew what that meant. Now, a baby's cry means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. At times like that, it can mean joy, celebration. It can mean fulfillment of dreams and hopes. Sometimes the cry of a baby can be grief, longing, disappointment for us. Sometimes the cry of a baby is exhaustion. When it's the 3 a.m. and the cry comes, right after the 2 a.m. cry, and right before the 4 a.m. cry that will precede the 5 a.m. cry, you can hear how that might be exhaustion. And actually, babies cry for so many different reasons. Sometimes babies will cry just out of joy, because God has put so much joy in them at being alive that they can't help but let it out. Sometimes they'll cry because they're figuring out this neat new thing called a voice that they have just discovered. Wow, what can I do with that? Then there's a different cry for when they're tired, that sort of fading whimper at the end of the day, or when it's nap time, or when they're wet, or they're lonely. But then there are other cries too. Sometimes babies cry out of terror. Sometimes they cry out of hunger. Sometimes they cry because they've been hurt. Sometimes they cry because they've been abused. Now, if this world was the way it's supposed to be, we would never hear those cries. Because if this world was the way it's supposed to be, no baby would ever have to cry like that, out of terror, hunger, out of being abused. No baby ought to cry that way. If this world was the way it should be, but we know better, don't we? We know what kind of world this is that we live in, because it breaks us down too. It hurts us too, and it has us trapped too. We know that this world is not as it should be, and yet this is the world that Jesus was born into and born for. And that's why we come here on this night. Amidst the longest nights of the year, we come here dressed up just a little bit, our parents on just a little bit better behavior. We come with new dresses and hair slicked down, with our voices just a little bit quieter, with our hearts just a little bit fuller. We gather here and crowd in among them around the manger, striving, seeking, waiting, listening, longing for that cry, for the birth cry of the Creator of the universe. Think of it. God who spins galaxies, lights stars, who watches the dance of the smallest particles. God who creates and is so clever and subtle that he can create through evolutionary means. God who watches the dance of time, the the flow of the river of time. God has chosen to be born among us. God with us. God has chosen to be here in our midst, in the midst of a world like this. God with us. And we gather around the manger on nights like this so we can listen for that cry, for the cry of the baby, because we know what that means. It means God is turning the world right side up. This world can't last the way it is. This world cannot stay this way, where power is used only to protect power, and where the value of a person is based on what they do or what they earn or what the color of their skin is or where they happen to have been born. This cannot be. And it cannot last like this, where babies cry as they never should. And so God has come into the midst of the world to be born among us and for us, for unto us a child is born. And we have heard his voice in the dark. And we know what that means. On that night when Jesus gave his birth cry, the whole earth started to shake. The world cannot last as it is because God is turning it right side up. God has come to make this world the way it ought to be. Now here we have gathered to hear that cry, and we know what that means. It means that we are now part of what God is doing. You are now part of God's work to set this world right side up. You are now part of God's beautiful, life-saving, world-altering work in the world. For you have gathered here to hear the baby. And so what do? We listen. We long. We reach out to take that hand. We listen for Jesus who is calling your name. We follow. We learn. We listen. We strive to live like him. For he is the Son of God, born for us. God is at work in the middle of the world, turning everything right side up. Thanks be to God.